Hello guys, welcome back to my channel Algorithm Minds. My name is Asan Khurram and in this channel I teach programming skills in Python, MATLAB and R programming. I also teach Tableau, a data visualization tool. So for today's tutorial, I'm going to teach you how you can actually plot a n by n matrix in MATLAB. N by n matrix in MATLAB is actually representation of data where a variable that is used to represent a matrix, in our case let's say A, has elements in rows and column, and we can access those elements of rows and column by the use of I and j, where I and j represents the indexing. Okay, so we are going to plot two charts. The first one is called heat map, the second one is called surface plot. So heat map represents the values of matrix element using colors, whereas a scatter plot, which is actually a 3D plot, represents the matrix as a three-dimensional plot, where we have x and y represents the rows and column of indices, and z represents the matrix values. Okay. Now that being said, let's move on towards our practical programming section. So the first thing we need to do is actually to create a matrix of n by n order. Here we are first initializing the size of matrix, like what are the total rows and columns we want in our matrix. For this purpose, we have initialized a variable named n, and we are equating its value to 5. Now, once we have defined the size of matrix, the next thing we are going to do, we are going to use a pre-built function in MATLAB that is called rand, that takes number of input arguments, but right now we are passing only single input argument, which is the size of matrix. Based on the input argument, this rand function will generate a matrix of order n, where n represents 5 rows and 5 columns, and each value within that matrix will be a randomly generated value between 0 and 1 that follows a normal distribution. That being said, when we have generated the matrix by using this MATLAB statement, the next thing we are going to do, we will simply visualize these elements by the help of this display command, and you can see that these values lie within the range of 0 to 1, and we have 5 rows and 5 columns. Let me just run this block of code for you. So now once we have generated our matrix, let's move on and actually plot the heat map. To create a heat map of a matrix, we use MATLAB's built-in function, which is called heat map, which will map the matrix values to the color scales. Okay, so in order to generate the heat map, first of all we are going to initialize a figure by using this statement, figure colon. The next thing we are going to do, we will call a MATLAB pre-built function heat map and pass one input argument, that is our matrix A. And after doing that, we will use some predefined statements for a plot in MATLAB. For example, we are using title, we are using X label, we are using Y label. These are used to title the plot and also label X axis and Y axis. So we are using, and then these functions title, X label, Y label take string as input arguments. So now that being done, the next thing we are going to do, we will simply just run this block of code. So now we have successfully plotted our heat map. This is what our heat maps look like, where we have I represents the rows and j represents the column, and these are the values that you are actually seeing in the heat map. Okay, so based on that, we can see that 0.9505 is color more darker as compared to 0.046, which is color white. Okay, so heat map represents the intensity of values by the help of color changes. Okay. The next thing we are going to do, we are going to plot a surface plot. A surface plot gives a 3D visualization of matrix. We will use the surf function in MATLAB to plot the surface plot of a matrix. Okay. So in order to plot a surface plot, the first thing we need to do is actually to create a pair of grid values. these grid values will be plotted or will be generated based on the size of matrix, or what are the total rows and what are the total columns in that specific matrix. Okay, so if in order to generate a grid map, a pair of values, we are going to use this function mesh grid, and we are passing two input argument which are actually the array uh, of row values. Okay, so here 1 colon n, where n stands for 5, so 1 colon n actually represents uh, an array from 1 to 5 with an interval of 1. Let me show you there in the command. So here I am writing 1 to colon 5, and when I put enter, now you can see that I have an array or a matrix with 1 row and 5 columns with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we are passing this thing here, an array, as an input argument to this function mesh grid, where first values below before comma represents rows, and values after comma represents column. Now that being done, when we generate the mesh grid or pair values of x and y, the next thing we are going to do, we will initialize a figure by using this statement, and the following statement will be a surf function which will actually generate the surface plot in MATLAB. And this surf function actually takes three input arguments. The first input argument is the x values, the second input argument is the y values, and the last input argument is actually the values that we actually want to generate. Okay, now that being said, we are going to use the functions title, x label, y label, and z label to make our plot more meaningful. All these functions will take string as an input argument. Next, we also want to display the color bar, where it actually changes the color based on the intensity of those values. Now let me run this code for you. Now you can see that we have successfully plotted our values. Now you can see that the values are actually between 0.1 to 1, which is actually what kind of values we do get from rand function. And we have like rows and we have columns. So that's how you can actually plot n by n matrix in MATLAB. I hope this tutorial have been helpful. If you have any question regarding today's tutorial, feel free to write down your comments. I will be happy to help you out. Thank you for joining me, and I will catch you soon in the next video.